I watched the water trickle through my backyard like it had for the past 15 years, never imagining that this gentle creek would become the center of a war that would ultimately destroy 3 houses and send 2 people to prison. My name is Lucas Brennan, and I bought my property in Riverside Oaks, Tennessee back in 2011 specifically because of that creek. The sound of running water had been my therapy after long days working as an electrician, and my golden retriever Bailey loved splashing through the shallow parts on hot summer afternoons. The house itself was modest, a 3-bedroom ranch with vinyl siding that had seen better days, but the 2 acres of land with that creek running right through the middle made it perfect. The homeowners association had been relatively quiet for most of those years. Monthly fees were reasonable at $75, and they mostly focused on making sure people did not leave trash cans out too long or paint their houses neon colors. That all changed when Margaret Whitmore became HOA president in January 2025. Margaret was everything you would expect from a stereotypical HOA tyrant. She was 53 years old with an asymmetrical blonde bob that probably cost more than my monthly grocery bill, and she drove a white Lexus SUV that she parked diagonally across 2 spaces at every HOA meeting. Her husband Richard worked in real estate development, which should have been my first warning sign about what was coming. The trouble started on a Tuesday morning in March when I came home from a job site to find Margaret standing at my property line with a clipboard and a man in a polo shirt holding a surveying tool. "Lucas," she called out with that fake cheerful voice she used when she wanted something. "Do you have a moment?" I climbed out of my truck, still wearing my work boots covered in drywall dust. "What's going on?" "We're just doing some measurements for a community improvement project." She smiled, but it did not reach her eyes. "Nothing you need to worry about." The surveyor was marking points along the creek where it passed between my property and the common area that ran behind several other houses in the neighborhood. Something about the whole scene made my stomach tighten. "What kind of project?" I asked, walking closer. "The HOA board has approved the creation of a community pond and recreational area. It's going to add significant value to everyone's property values." Margaret flipped through papers on her clipboard without looking at me. "The pond will be situated in the common area, utilizing the natural water flow from the creek." I stared at her. "The creek that runs through my property?" "The creek runs through multiple properties, Lucas. The water doesn't belong to any single homeowner." She said this like she was explaining something to a child. "The pond will be a wonderful amenity. We're thinking of adding benches, perhaps some landscaping. And you're planning to block the creek to fill this pond?" The implications were starting to sink in. "Where's the water going to go?" "Our engineer has assured us that the natural overflow will continue downstream. This is all perfectly legal and within the HOA's rights according to our bylaws." Margaret nodded to the surveyor, who continued his work. "There will be an informational meeting next week if you have questions." She walked away before I could respond, her heels sinking slightly into the soft ground near the creek bank. That night, I pulled out my HOA documents and read through every page of the covenants and restrictions. Nowhere did it say the HOA had rights to alter natural water flow through private properties. I called my neighbor Tom Richardson, whose property was also along the creek. "Yeah, I heard about it," Tom said. He was 71 and had lived in Riverside Oaks since the development was built in 1998. "Margaret came by last week with some papers for me to sign, giving permission for water flow alteration. I told her I needed to think about it." "Did you sign?" "Hell no. Something felt off about the whole thing." Tom paused. "You know her husband is trying to get that big commercial development approved over on Highway 70? Word is they need to show increased property values in this area to get financing." The pieces were clicking together. This was not about community improvement. This was about Margaret and Richard's business interests. I spent the next week calling everyone I could think of. A lawyer friend told me that water rights in Tennessee were complicated, but that the HOA likely did not have the authority to significantly alter natural water flow without permission from all affected property owners. The problem was that fighting it would cost money I did not have much of. The informational meeting was held on a Thursday evening at the community clubhouse. About 30 homeowners showed up, most of them probably drawn by the promise of free coffee and cookies that Margaret always provided for these things. Margaret stood at the front with a PowerPoint presentation showing glossy renderings of a picturesque pond surrounded by walking paths and flower gardens. As you can see, this will transform our common area into a true community gathering space. Property values in similar neighborhoods have increased by an average of 8% after adding water features. An older woman in the front row raised her hand. "Where's the money coming from?" "We have sufficient reserves, and we've secured a grant from the county for environmental beautification projects." Margaret advanced to the next slide. "Construction will begin in 2 weeks." I stood up. "You cannot just block a natural creek without proper permits and permission from property owners." The room went quiet. Margaret's smile tightened. "The creek runs through HOA common area, Lucas. We have every right to make improvements to common areas. That's what HOA fees pay for. The creek originates on my property and flows through Tom Richardson's property as well. You would be affecting our water rights." "I have consulted with our attorney, and I assure you this is completely legal." Margaret's voice took on an edge. "Unless you have a law degree I'm not aware of." A few people chuckled. I felt my face getting hot. Tom stood up next to me. "I would like to see the permits and engineering reports. All documents are available for review by appointment." Margaret was already moving to the next slide. "Now, let's discuss the landscaping plans." I left the meeting angry and frustrated. Margaret had clearly done her homework enough to have answers ready, even if those answers were probably garbage. The problem was that I did not have the time or money to immediately lawyer up and stop this thing. 2 weeks later, the construction crews arrived. I was working a job in Knoxville that day, about an hour away. Tom called me at 10 in the morning. "Luke, you need to get back here. They've got excavators tearing up the common area." "Already? I thought they needed permits." "They've got permits posted. I tried to look at them, but the foreman told me to stay back from the work zone." I told my boss I had an emergency and drove back to Riverside Oaks, going probably 15 miles over the speed limit the whole way. When I pulled into the neighborhood, I could hear the machinery before I could see it. 3 large excavators were digging an enormous pit in the common area about 200 feet from my back property line. The creek was still flowing, but I could see where they had marked out positions for what looked like a dam or barrier. Margaret was there, wearing designer jeans and rain boots that probably cost $200, standing well back from the actual work while talking on her phone. I parked and walked straight over to the permits posted on a temporary fence. They looked official enough. Grading permit, stormwater management permit, water feature construction permit, all approved by the county and dated from 2 months ago. "How did you get these approved 2 months ago when you just announced this project 3 weeks ago?" I demanded, walking up to Margaret. She ended her phone call and turned to me. "The board had been working on this for quite some time, Lucas. We only announced it to the general membership once we had all our approvals in place. The board is supposed to have open meetings. We had executive sessions to discuss financial and legal matters. That's perfectly within our rights." She smiled that infuriating smile. "I understand you're upset about change, but I think you'll find this enhances your property value significantly. What happens when you block the creek? Where does the overflow go?" "The engineering report addresses all drainage concerns. The pond will have a natural overflow spillway that feeds back into the creek downstream. It's all been professionally designed." Over the next week, I watched them dig a pond that was roughly 60 feet across and 8 feet deep at its center. The dirt they excavated got piled up and shaped into berms around the edges. It actually looked like it might be nice when it was finished, which made me even more suspicious. On a Wednesday morning, they started building the dam. This was not some sophisticated concrete structure. It was basically a wall of clay and rocks with some kind of rubber liner, positioned right where the creek flowed into what would become the pond. They left a pipe at the bottom to allow some water flow while the pond filled. I stood at my back fence, watching this happen with Bailey sitting next to me, her tail thumping against my leg. "This is a bad idea, girl," I muttered. She barked once, like she agreed. Tom came over that evening. We stood at the fence watching water start to pool behind the new dam. "That overflow spillway they mentioned," Tom pointed. "That's just going to be a notch in the berm over there. That's supposed to handle overflow from the entire creek?" Apparently their engineer thinks so. Their engineer is either incompetent or was told what conclusions to reach. Tom shook his head. You know whose properties are directly downstream from that spillway? I looked at the slope of the land. Oh no. Yep. Margaret's house, Richard's business partner Kenneth Sawyer's house, and board member Patricia Hoffman's house. All three have walkout basements that back up to the common area. They built a dam upstream from their own houses? I guess they trust their engineer. Tom did not sound convinced. The pond took about a week to fill. The creek flow slowed to barely a trickle below the dam, which I had to admit was within their rights since water was still flowing. My section of creek got shallower, but it did not dry up completely. For about 2 weeks, everything seemed fine. The pond sat there, looking exactly like Margaret's glossy renderings. They installed benches and started planting flowers. A few neighbors even commented that it looked nice. Then April brought the rain. Tennessee spring weather is unpredictable, but that year was exceptional. We got 3 inches of rain on a Monday, another 2 inches on Tuesday, and forecasts showed a major storm system moving in for the weekend. I was not particularly worried at first. The creek had handled heavy rain before, but now there was a dam in the way. By Wednesday, I noticed the pond level had risen significantly. The overflow spillway was functioning, sending water down through that notch in the berm, but the creek behind my house was running much higher and faster than normal because the dam was creating a bottleneck. I called Margaret. The pond is too full. That dam is backing water up. The system is working exactly as designed, Lucas. The overflow is handling the excess water. The creek on my property is flooding. That's a natural consequence of heavy rain. It's not the HOA's responsibility. She hung up before I could argue further. Thursday brought another 1.5 inches of rain. The pond was now overflowing constantly, sending a steady stream of water down toward those 3 houses. I could not see them from my property, but Tom told me the runoff was creating a small river through the common area. Friday morning, the real storm hit. I had never seen rain like this in Tennessee. It started at 6 in the morning and did not let up for 14 hours. The Weather Service issued flash flood warnings for the entire county. Roads started closing, small creeks turned into raging torrents, and the pond kept filling. By noon, I could see from my back fence that the water level was at least 2 feet higher than the top of the dam. The overflow spillway was sending what looked like a waterfall down the slope. The careful landscaping they had done was already washing away. At 2 in the afternoon, my phone rang. It was Tom. Luke, you need to see this. Margaret's basement is flooding. What? Get over to Oakmont Drive. It's chaos. I grabbed my truck keys and drove around to the other side of the neighborhood. Oakmont Drive ran parallel to the common area where the 3 board members' houses backed up. Even from the street, I could see the disaster. Water was pouring down the slope from the overflowing pond like a river. The drainage system that was supposed to handle runoff was completely overwhelmed, and all that water was flowing directly toward 3 very expensive houses. Margaret's white Lexus was parked at an angle in her driveway, and she was standing in her garage screaming at Richard and 2 other men who were trying to use sandbags to block the garage door. "It's coming in too fast," one of the men yelled. I parked across the street and walked over. Margaret saw me and her face went from panic to furious in an instant. "This is your fault," she shrieked. "You told me the system would work." This last part was directed at a man in a golf shirt who I assumed was the engineer. "The rainfall amounts exceeded reasonable projections," the engineer said, looking miserable and soaked to the bone. "My basement has 3 feet of water. I have Persian rugs down there. My furniture." Margaret was nearly crying now. 2 houses down, Kenneth Sawyer was running a sump pump that was clearly losing the battle against the incoming water. The pump was ejecting water as fast as it could, but more just kept coming. Patricia Hoffman's house, the 3rd property in the flood path, had water visibly pouring out from under the garage door. "You need to breach the dam," I said loudly enough for everyone to hear. They all turned to look at me. "Breach what?" Margaret demanded. "The dam you built. It's causing this. The pond cannot handle this much water, and all the overflow is coming straight down here. If you breach the dam, the creek will flow normally again and stop flooding your basements." "We cannot just destroy HOA property." Margaret looked appalled at the suggestion. "You can't afford not to. Every minute that dam stays up, thousands more gallons are flooding your houses." The engineer stepped forward. He's right. The dam is creating an artificial reservoir that's overflowing beyond its capacity. If we release the pressure, the water will disperse through the natural creek bed. Richard, who had been silent until now, grabbed Margaret's arm. Do it. The water damage is going to cost a fortune as it is. But the pond, all that money? Margaret! Richard's voice was sharp. Our basement is flooding. Kenneth's basement is flooding. Patricia's basement is flooding. Break the damn dam! Margaret looked like she wanted to argue more, but another surge of water rushed down the slope and added another 2 inches to the flood pouring into her garage. Fine, do it. The engineer made some phone calls. The excavator operator who had built the dam had actually stayed in the area because of the weather warnings. He agreed to come out, but said it would take him at least 45 minutes in the storm. Those 45 minutes were some of the most surreal of my life. I stood under an umbrella with about a dozen other neighbors who had come to watch the disaster unfold. Margaret paced in her garage, occasionally going inside to check on the basement damage, then coming back out to glare at the water pouring down the hill. The rain finally started to let up around 3:30, just before the excavator arrived, but the damage was already done. The operator waded through the muck in the common area and positioned his machine at the base of the dam. "You want me to just tear it open?" he shouted over the noise of the engine. "Yes," Margaret yelled back. "All of it! Get rid of it!" The excavator bucket smashed into the clay and rock wall. Water immediately started gushing through the breach. Within minutes, the operator had torn a 20-foot gap in the dam, and the pond was draining like someone had pulled a giant plug. The water roared through the gap and surged down the natural creek bed, which ran along the side of the common area away from the houses. It was dramatic and violent, but it was going where it was supposed to go. The overflow that had been flooding the 3 basements slowed to a trickle, then stopped entirely within about 10 minutes. Margaret stood in her driveway watching her expensive pond project literally drain away. Her face was pale and her hands were shaking. The immediate crisis was over, but the aftermath was just beginning. Over the next few days, the extent of the damage became clear. Margaret's basement had sustained approximately $40,000 in damage. Kenneth Sawyer's was worse at around $55,000 because he had a home theater system that was completely destroyed. Patricia Hoffman's was the least damaged at $30,000, mostly because she had fewer belongings stored down there. All 3 filed insurance claims, and all 3 got the same response. Flooding caused by improper drainage or construction was not covered under their standard policies. The HOA's insurance company also denied coverage, stating that the damage was caused by negligent construction and engineering, which was specifically excluded from their policy. Margaret called an emergency HOA meeting for the following Tuesday. The clubhouse was packed with angry homeowners. "We need to assess each household for the repairs," Margaret announced, looking like she had not slept in days. "The total damage is approximately $135,000, which divided among the 83 households in Riverside Oaks comes to approximately $1,627 per household." The room erupted. "You want us to pay for your basement?" someone shouted. "This was an HOA project that caused HOA member damage. The costs need to be shared by the community." Tom Richardson stood up. "The costs need to be paid by whoever approved this disaster of a project. Who signed off on the engineering report? Who approved the construction? Where was the oversight?" Margaret's face flushed. "The board voted to approve this project. The engineer provided professional assessments that it was safe and appropriate." "I want to see the engineering report," I said, standing up. "The full report, not just a summary." "That's confidential HOA documentation." "Actually, it's not," said a woman I recognized as Sarah Mills, who worked as a paralegal. "HOA members have a right to review any documents related to expenditures and projects. That's Tennessee state law." Margaret looked at her lawyer, who had come to the meeting. He nodded reluctantly. "Members have a right to review the report." "Fine. You can make an appointment to review it at the HOA office." Margaret was clearly stalling. "I want it provided to all members digitally within 48 hours, Sarah pressed. "This is a material issue affecting all of us." The lawyer whispered something to Margaret. She closed her eyes briefly, then nodded. "The report will be distributed." The meeting devolved into shouting after that. No vote was taken on the special assessment. Margaret adjourned the meeting early, claiming it was no longer productive. The engineering report arrived in my email 2 days later. It was 23 pages long, and I read every single word. The report was dated from February and had been prepared by Hartwell Engineering Associates. It recommended a pond no larger than 40 feet across and no deeper than 5 feet, with a professional overflow system including piping and a concrete spillway. It specifically warned that a larger pond or inadequate drainage could cause flooding to downstream properties. I read that paragraph 3 times to make sure I understood what I was seeing. The pond that was actually built was 60 feet across and 8 feet deep, and the overflow system was just a notch in a dirt berm. Margaret and the board had not followed the engineering recommendations at all. They had gone bigger and cheaper, and it had literally blown up in their faces. I forwarded the report to Tom, Sarah, and about a dozen other people I knew in the neighborhood. By that evening, the entire community was talking about it. Sarah called me Friday morning. "Luke, I think we have grounds to remove the entire board for negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. I talked to a friend who specializes in HOA law. If you are willing to be the plaintiff, we might be able to file an action." What would that accomplish? It would remove Margaret and the other board members, potentially hold them personally liable for the damages, and prevent this kind of thing from happening again. Sarah paused. "I know you did not want to spend money on lawyers, but my friend said he would do this on contingency because it's such a clear-cut case of negligence." I thought about Margaret's smug face when she had told me the project was perfectly legal. "Let's do it." The lawsuit was filed the following week. Lucas Brennan, Tom Richardson, and 15 other homeowners versus Margaret Whitmore, Kenneth Sawyer, Patricia Hoffman, and the Riverside Oaks Homeowners Association Board of Directors. We alleged negligence, breach of fiduciary duty, and misappropriation of HOA funds. Margaret tried to defend herself at first. She hired an expensive lawyer and filed a motion to dismiss the case, but the evidence was overwhelming. We had the engineering report showing they had not followed professional recommendations. We had meeting minutes showing the board had approved the project in executive session without proper member input. We had receipts showing they had spent $97,000 of HOA funds on the project without a vote from the membership. The judge denied the motion to dismiss and set a trial date for August. That's when things got interesting. Kenneth Sawyer broke first. His lawyer reached out to ours and said Kenneth wanted to settle and testify against Margaret. It turned out that Kenneth had opposed the larger pond size, but Margaret had pushed it through anyway. He agreed to resign from the board and pay his own damages in exchange for being dropped from the suit. Patricia Hoffman folded next. She also resigned and settled, admitting she had not actually read the engineering report before voting to approve the project. That left Margaret standing alone. The trial was scheduled for August 15th, but a week before, something new came to light. Sarah had been digging through HOA financial records as part of discovery, and she found something interesting. The grant that Margaret had mentioned for the project, it did not exist. There was no grant money. Instead, Margaret had taken out a loan in the HOA's name without proper authorization, using her position as president to sign documents that required a full board vote. That crossed a line from negligence into potential fraud. Sarah brought this to our lawyer, who immediately contacted the district attorney's office. Taking out fraudulent loans using an HOA's identity could be criminal. On August 8th, 1 week before trial, 2 detectives showed up at Margaret's house and asked her to come down to the station for questioning. I heard about this from Tom, who heard it from his next-door neighbor who was friends with Margaret's hairdresser. Small communities are great for gossip, less great for privacy. Margaret came home 3 hours later. No arrest was made that day, but the investigation was clearly ongoing. The civil trial proceeded as scheduled. Margaret showed up looking exhausted and defeated. Her expensive lawyer had apparently quit, and she was represented by a public defender type who looked fresh out of law school. The trial lasted 2 days. Our side presented the engineering report, the financial records, testimony from Kenneth and Patricia about how Margaret had pushed the project through, and documentation of the damage caused. Margaret's defense was basically that she had been trying to help the community and had made an honest mistake. She claimed she thought the engineering report was just suggestions, not requirements, and that she had believed the loan paperwork was legitimate. The jury deliberated for less than 3 hours. They found Margaret personally liable for negligence and breach of fiduciary duty. The judge ordered her to repay the $97,000 spent on the project, plus the $135,000 in damages to the 3 basements, plus legal fees. Margaret went pale when the verdict was read. There was no way she had that kind of money, but the criminal case was still pending. The district attorney filed charges in September. Margaret was indicted on 3 counts: fraud for the fake loan, misappropriation of funds for using HOA money without authorization, and making false statements on financial documents. Richard filed for divorce in October. He claimed he had no knowledge of what Margaret had done and wanted to protect his assets. I did not feel particularly sorry for him. The criminal trial was in January 2026. I was called as a witness to describe the project and the damage it caused. Margaret looked like a completely different person from the polished HOA president I had first met. She had lost weight, her hair had gone mostly gray, and she wore a cheap blazer that did not quite fit. The prosecution laid out a clear case. Margaret had forged documents to make it look like the board had approved the loan. She had inflated cost estimates to take out more money than needed, pocketing about $15,000 for herself. She had lied to homeowners about having proper permits and engineering approval. The defense tried to argue that Margaret had been overwhelmed and made mistakes, but had not intended to defraud anyone. The jury did not buy it. Margaret was convicted on all 3 counts in late January. Sentencing was scheduled for March. In the meantime, life in Riverside Oaks slowly returned to normal. We held emergency elections for the HOA board. Tom Richardson became president, and we elected several other reasonable people who promised transparency and fiscal responsibility. The first thing the new board did was vote to keep HOA fees minimal and require member votes on any project costing over $5,000. The destroyed pond area was filled in and reseeded with grass. Within a few months, you could barely tell there had ever been a pond there at all. The creek flowed freely through the common area again, and the sound of running water returned to my backyard. Margaret's sentencing hearing was on March 20th. I drove to the courthouse, feeling like I needed to see this through to the end. The prosecutor asked for prison time, arguing that Margaret had abused her position of trust and caused significant financial harm to her neighbors. The defense asked for probation and community service, arguing that Margaret had no prior record and had not been motivated by greed but by misguided ambition. The judge was a woman in her 60s who had been on the bench for 20 years. She looked at Margaret for a long moment before speaking. "Mrs. Whitmore, you held a position of trust in your community. Your neighbors elected you to manage their collective interests, and you betrayed that trust repeatedly. You falsified documents, you took out fraudulent loans, you lied to your community, and you proceeded with a project you knew was not properly engineered. When that project failed, your first instinct was to make your neighbors pay for your mistakes. This was not a momentary lapse in judgment. This was a pattern of deceptive behavior over many months." Margaret was crying silently. Depot. "However, I also note that you have no prior criminal record and that you are already facing significant financial consequences through the civil judgment against you. The state has recommended 18 months in prison. I'm going to sentence you to 12 months in county jail, followed by 4 years of probation and 500 hours of community service. You are also ordered to make restitution for all funds misappropriated from the HOA." Margaret was taken into custody immediately. I watched the bailiff lead her out of the courtroom, and I felt an odd mix of satisfaction and sadness. She had brought this entirely on herself, but it was still sobering to watch someone's life fall apart. I walked out of the courthouse into bright spring sunshine. My phone buzzed with a text from Tom. "How did it go?" 12 months in jail," I typed back. "It's over." "Good. Come by later. Janet made her lemon cake." I drove home through familiar streets, past houses I had known for 15 years. When I pulled into my driveway, Bailey came running from the backyard, tail wagging frantically. "Hey girl," I said, scratching behind her ears. "Want to go see the creek?" We walked out to the back fence together. The water was running clear and steady, exactly like it had for years before Margaret decided to improve it. The grass was growing back where the heavy equipment had torn up the ground. Nature was reclaiming its space. I could hear kids playing in someone's yard a few houses over. A lawnmower started up nearby. Normal suburban sounds of a Tuesday afternoon. The whole disaster had taken just over a year from start to finish. 1 year of meetings and lawyers and floods and trials. 1 year of watching someone destroy themselves through arrogance and greed. But my creek was still here, flowing through my backyard like it always had. Bailey jumped in the shallow part and splashed around, sending droplets sparkling in the afternoon sun. I sat down on the fence post and watched the water flow. There was something deeply satisfying about the simplicity of it. Water flowed downhill. That was a fundamental law of nature. Margaret had thought she could control it, redirect it, profit from it, and nature had reminded her very quickly that some things cannot be controlled. The civil judgment meant Margaret would probably be paying off debt for the rest of her life. The house she and Richard had shared was for sale, and the asking price suggested they were desperate to unload it. Richard had moved into a condo downtown. Kenneth Sawyer had quietly repaired his basement and kept his head down. Patricia Hoffman had moved away entirely, selling her house and relocating to Florida. The new HOA board was everything the old one was not. Tom sent out detailed financial reports every quarter. Every expense over $500 got discussed at open meetings. When the clubhouse needed a new roof, we got 3 bids, and the membership voted on which contractor to hire. It was boring. It was responsible. It was exactly what an HOA should be. I got a call in April from a reporter at the Knoxville News Sentinel who had heard about the case and wanted to do a story. I agreed to an interview, figuring it might help other people recognize warning signs in their own HOAs. The article ran in early May with the headline, "When HOAs Go Wrong, How One President's Vanity Project Led to Disaster." It detailed the whole saga, including the flooding, the lawsuit, and Margaret's criminal conviction. The reporter had done good work, interviewing multiple residents and getting quotes from the engineers about what had gone wrong. Within a day, the story had been picked up by several national news outlets. Apparently, HOA horror stories played well with audiences around the country. My phone started ringing with requests for more interviews. A producer from a cable news show wanted me to come on and talk about HOA overreach. A podcast about legal disasters wanted to do an episode about the case. I declined most of them. I'd never wanted to be the face of HOA resistance or whatever narrative they were trying to push. I just wanted my creek to flow in peace, but I did agree to speak at a state legislative committee hearing in June. Tennessee was considering new laws to regulate HOA governance and increase transparency requirements. Several other people who had dealt with HOA problems testified as well, sharing stories of arbitrary fines, selective enforcement, and financial mismanagement. The committee seemed genuinely interested. One legislator told me afterward that she had been dealing with her own nightmare HOA and was determined to push through reforms. I had no idea if anything would actually change, but it felt good to at least try. Summer settled in hot and humid. The creek level dropped to its normal low summer flow, just enough to keep the fish alive and give Bailey a place to cool off. I installed a small patio in my backyard and got an outdoor fire pit. Tom and his wife Janet came over some evenings, and we would sit watching the water and talking about nothing important. "You ever think about what might have happened if you had not fought her?" Tom asked one evening in July. I had thought about it. She would have gotten away with it, pushed through the special assessment, made everyone pay for her mistakes, and probably done something else equally stupid a year later. You saved this neighborhood, you know, not just from the flood, but from having leaders who thought they could do whatever they wanted. I was not sure I had saved anything. I'd just refused to go along with something I knew was wrong. But maybe that was enough sometimes. Margaret was released from jail in March 2027 after serving her full 12-month sentence. I heard through the neighborhood gossip network that she moved in with her sister in Chattanooga. She was reportedly working as a receptionist at a dental office and keeping her head down. I hoped she had learned something from the experience, but I honestly did not care much either way. She was out of my life and out of Riverside Oaks. The civil judgment was still hanging over her head. Our lawyer had arranged for her wages to be garnished, so she would be paying us back in small increments for years. It would not amount to much individually. Each household was only going to recover a few $100s, but it was the principle of the thing. By the fall of 2027, The whole incident had faded into neighborhood legend. New residents moving in would hear the story and shake their heads in disbelief. Someone actually tried to dam up the creek? That's insane. Yes, it was insane, but it had happened. I continued working as an electrician, coming home to my house and my creek and my dog. Bailey was getting older now, moving a little slower, but she still loved her time in the water. I had added some flat stones to make it easier for her to get in and out. The property values in Riverside Oaks had actually gone up, despite, or maybe because of everything that had happened. The story had gotten enough attention that people knew we had an HOA that took financial responsibility seriously now. That was apparently attractive to buyers. Tom served 2 years as HOA president before declining to run again. A woman named Linda Chen took over, and she was just as committed to keeping things simple and transparent. The HOA became what it should have been all along, a quiet, administrative body that handled common area maintenance and stayed out of people's lives. I thought about writing a book about the experience. A publisher had actually reached out about it after the news articles, but I could never quite muster the energy. The story had been stressful to live through. Writing it all down in detail sounded exhausting. Instead, I just enjoyed my creek. On warm evenings, I would take a chair out to the backyard and sit listening to the water. Sometimes I would read. Sometimes I would just think. Sometimes I would fall asleep to the sound of flowing water and wake up as the sun was setting. Bailey passed away in November 2027. She was 13 years old, which was a good long life for a golden retriever. I buried her in the backyard near the creek she had loved so much, under a maple tree that turned brilliant red every fall. I adopted another dog from the shelter in January, a mixed breed named Cooper, who was 2 years old and had boundless energy. He loved the creek just as much as Bailey had, jumping in even when the water was freezing cold. Life moved on. That's what it did. The dramatic events faded into memory, becoming stories I would tell occasionally when the context was right. The creek kept flowing, the seasons kept changing, the neighborhood kept turning over with new families moving in and old ones moving out. In the spring of 2028, I got a card in the mail. It was from Margaret. I almost threw it away without opening it, but curiosity got the better of me. The card was simple, just a plain note card with a handwritten message inside. Lucas, I know you have no reason to listen to anything I say, but I wanted you to know that I understand now what I did wrong. I let my ego and my ambitions hurt people I was supposed to serve. I am sorry for the damage I caused to you and to the neighborhood. I am working on being a better person. I hope your creek is flowing well. Margaret. I read it twice, then set it on my kitchen counter. I did not know what to do with an apology from someone who had caused so much trouble. Part of me was still angry. Part of me appreciated the gesture. Mostly I just felt tired thinking about the whole thing again. I never responded to the card. I did not know what I would say, but I did not throw it away either. It sat on my counter for a few weeks before I finally filed it away in a drawer with other random documents. Maybe Margaret really had learned something. Maybe she was just trying to make herself feel better. It did not really matter to me either way. The apology did not change what had happened, but it also did not make things worse. It just was. Tom retired in 2028 and spent most of his time traveling with Janet. They sent me postcards from national parks around the country. I was happy for them. They had earned their peace. I turned 45 that year and realized I had spent nearly a third of my life in this house, on this property, with this creek. It was strange to think about. When I had bought the place at 30, I had figured I would stay 5 or 10 years before moving on to something bigger or better. But I had never found anywhere I wanted to be more than right here, listening to the water flow through my backyard. The HOA was running smoothly under Linda's leadership. Our reserves were healthy. The common areas were well maintained. No one was trying to build any more ponds, thank God. I occasionally got emails from people in other parts of the country dealing with their own HOA problems. The articles about our situation apparently came up when people searched for information about HOA overreach. Most of them just wanted advice or wanted to share their own horror stories. I tried to respond when I could, usually with the same basic message. Document everything, know your rights, and do not be afraid to fight back when the HOA is clearly in the wrong. It was not profound wisdom, but it was what I had learned. Some people took the advice and successfully challenged their HOAs. Others got discouraged and gave up. A few ended up in protracted legal battles that seemed to cause more stress than they solved. Every situation was different. One guy from Arizona thanked me for inspiring him to run for his HOA board. He got elected and helped institute reforms similar to what we had done in Riverside Oaks. That felt good, knowing that something positive had come from our disaster. In the summer of 2029, my parents came to visit from Florida. They had moved down there years ago for the weather and the lower taxes. Dad had some mobility issues now and used a walker, but he was still sharp as ever. We sat in the backyard on a warm June evening, listening to the creek and watching Cooper play. "You've done well with this place," Dad said. "It's peaceful." "It is now. It was not so peaceful for a while there," Mom laughed. "That HOA woman, I still cannot believe someone could be that foolish. Damming up a creek? What did she think would happen?" "She thought she could control it, make it into something prettier and more valuable." I sipped my beer. "She forgot that nature does not care about your plans." Dad nodded slowly. "There's a lesson in there somewhere, about knowing your limitations, about respecting things that existed long before you came along." "The creek has been here a lot longer than any of us," I agreed. "It will be here long after we are gone." We sat in comfortable silence for a while, 3 generations connected by blood and the simple act of watching water flow past. I thought about everything that had happened over the past few years, the conflict, the stress, the anger, the vindication. It had all been so intense at the time, consuming so much energy and emotion. But now, sitting here with my parents and my dog and my creek, it all seemed small and distant. Life had moved on. The creek kept flowing. That was the thing about nature. It was indifferent to human drama. Water flowed downhill whether Margaret approved or not. My parents left after a week, heading back to Florida and their retirement community. I hugged them both goodbye and told them to visit again soon. As I watched their car disappear down the street, I felt a deep sense of contentment. This was my home. This was my life. It was not glamorous or exciting, but it was mine. The creek in my backyard was worth more to me than any amenity Margaret could have built. I went back inside and looked at the calendar. Tom and Janet were coming over Friday for dinner. I had a job scheduled for next week installing new lighting in a restaurant downtown. Cooper needed to go to the vet for his annual checkup. Normal life, mundane details. Exactly what I wanted. The story of the HOA and the dam and the flood was becoming more abstract with time, like something that had happened to someone else. I could remember the facts of it clearly enough, but the emotional weight had faded. That was probably healthy. You could not stay angry forever. You could not keep fighting battles that were already won. At some point, you had to let go and move forward. Margaret was living her life in Chattanooga, probably still paying off her debt and dealing with the consequences of her choices. Kenneth and Patricia were wherever they were, doing whatever they were doing. Richard had apparently remarried and moved to Nashville. They were all characters in a story that was over. And I was still here, in my house in Riverside Oaks, Tennessee, with a creek running through my backyard and a dog who loved the water. The sound of that flowing water was the soundtrack to my life, constant and unchanging. Sometimes at night, when everything was quiet, I would stand at my back window and listen. The water murmured over rocks and around roots, a sound that had existed for thousands of years before humans built houses here, and would exist for thousands more after those houses crumbled. It was humbling and comforting at the same time. My problems were temporary. The creek was eternal. I had fought to protect it, not because I was some great environmental warrior, but because it was mine, and I loved it. That was enough. The lawyers and judges and news articles had all treated this like some important case about HOA governance and legal liability. And maybe it was that, on some level. Maybe some good had come from the reforms and the attention, but for me, it had always been simpler. It was about a creek in my backyard and someone who tried to mess with it. I had stood up and said no. The creek had done the rest, proving that you cannot fight nature and win. Years from now, when I was old and gray, I would still be listening to this water. I would still be sitting in my backyard, watching it flow. And I would tell the story occasionally about the HOA president who tried to build a pond and ended up flooding her own basement. People would laugh and shake their heads and say, Margaret got what she deserved. And they would be right. But they would also miss the point. The point was not about justice or revenge or even accountability. The point was that water flows downhill. Everything else was just humans learning that lesson the hard way. I poured myself a drink and walked out to the backyard one more time. Cooper was already there, lying in the shallow part of the creek to cool off from the summer heat. He looked up at me and his tail thumped against the water. Good boy, I said. He went back to his cooling session. I sat on my patio chair and listened to the water and felt completely at peace. This was it. This was enough. A house, a creek, a dog, and the simple satisfaction of knowing I had protected something worth protecting. Margaret had wanted to build something impressive. She had wanted to increase property values and make her mark on the neighborhood. She had wanted recognition and admiration. I just wanted my creek to keep flowing. And it did. That was the whole story. Everything else was details.